every community in the United States, and in the world for that matter, has all of the core elements of a food ecosystem. You don't have to go out and find them. They're already there doing business in these spaces, whether it's the distribution, logistics, farming, production, waste removal, retail, grocery, restaurants, culinary. They all exist simultaneously in your community, and it doesn't matter where your community is.
Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon. Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon.
Hello, and welcome to With Bowl and Spoon. This is a podcast about people's personal food evolution, and today my guest is Joe Bute. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Well, a little bit about me. I've been eating since I was a child. So my historical relationship with food goes a long way back. I'm not going to tell you how long, so that's for me to know and you to find out. I actually started getting involved more in the food space around 2010. And that's when I was coming out of about 15 years as a private equity investor. We were doing a number of food-related businesses when I was with these companies, but it wasn't specifically devoted to focusing on the food industry or the food system in terms of that. It was strictly related as an investment. But back in 2010, I had a moment in my life when I changed careers, and I left the world of investment banking involuntarily. And I was sitting there trying to think about what I was going to do, and my daughter Samantha, who's pretty instrumental in this story, she was a food blogger before I was a food development guy. She said, well, you know, Dad, what you ought to do is you ought to marry your two life experiences. The first 20 years of your life was involved in community organization and community development in Chicago and San Francisco and the last stop in Pittsburgh. And the last half of your life has been in the world of investment and business and enterprise. So why don't you do what you've been talking about, which is get involved in something that has social impact related to it, but looking at it from a business standpoint. We sat down and began to brainstorm about what that would look like, and we had to name the thing, right? Because you couldn't just say it was the Joe Bute Project, so you had to come up with something. But what we did was we took a look at what was really sort of near and dear to us in terms of our own life experiences. And my mom and dad actually had left Chicago years ago and opened up a country inn down in Charlottesville, Virginia. And the inn's name was Hollymead. They had restored a pre-Civil War farmhouse and turned it into a bed and breakfast and a country dining experience, and they call it Hollymead Inn. So Sam's brilliant idea was, why don't you call it Hollymead? And so from there we said, yeah, that works. We'll call it Hollymead Capital because it has to sound like it's a business-related activity, right? And that's the beginning of how we got into this thing in a more formal and focused way. The interesting thing was that when we began to think about what we wanted to do from a social impact perspective, social impact investing can take a look at several areas of development, but usually around things that are essentially basic needs or basic necessities, right? So food is one of those things, energy is another one of those things, housing is another one of those things. So we decided we would open the door and take a look at what was most easy to do, and we actually picked food first. And as luck would have it, the first thing that we got an engagement on was actually to go down to Uniontown, and we were invited by the Fayette County Community Action Agency and to develop a business plan for what eventually became Republic Food Enterprise Center. We even gave it the name, by the way, just so you know. So that was our idea. So we assembled a really cool team of experts in this field that understood something about shared use kitchens and food hubs. That was sort of the buzz that was going on all over the country. Everybody was talking about food hubs at the time. You might remember that.
I do.
Yeah, and so people that I knew in my network, which was how I do everything. So a good friend of mine, Rita Resick. Rita and her husband own a farm out in the Laurel Valley. Of Somerset County, Laurel Vista Farm. but Rita was my resident expert on small farms converting their food products into marketable products. She and Rick already had product that was on the shelf. She was one of our technical people on the Food Enterprise Center, and she actually had done some canning over there already. So the other guy I picked up on, who was no surprise, was Greg Bullis from Blackberry Meadow Farm. And Greg and I had been talking to each other about food enterprises and food entrepreneurship at that point, and so he became the next team member. The third was a gentleman named Len Carrick, and Len was a serial entrepreneur. And he fits into the story a little bit later too, because he comes back into the story. And so we came and put together a comprehensive business development plan for Republic, and we actually got them the money that they eventually used to open the place up from the Office of Community Services at the federal level. Right. So that was our first experience of really doing something concrete about building a food business model in a community environment where we were looking at impact on the community and looking at it from several different perspectives, right? One was one of the big challenges that we were focusing on back in 2010, and we're still focusing on it today, is that most farms are not economically viable. So when everybody complains about the fact that nobody wants to get into farming, that's because nobody's an idiot. If you think about it logically, we need to get more vets in farming. Oh, why? So they can lose their ass in farming. Yeah, that's great, a great idea. That's a super idea. And so one of the challenges that we wanted to take on, we started doing that in 2010 and continued all the way to today with Food21, is to find as many ways as we can to enhance on-farm income and increase the financial viability of the family farm. And you know the numbers really well. I can recite them. You've got about 12,000 family-owned farms basically in Western Pennsylvania. There's about 10,000 to 11,000 that are not financially self-sustaining without off-farm income, and the other 1,000, are doing okay. But the reality is that that's always been a big challenge, and in our opinion, my opinion at least, it's always been not well thought out, even at the state policy level. When you talk about the State Department of Agriculture and on-farm businesses and value-added products and all those other things that get involved in this conversation.
Well, you mentioned farming isn't profitable, and USDA wants to give you loans all the time.
Right, yeah.
I don't need a loan. I need you to just give me some money.
So I don't have any other way to pay the loan back, but that's what I need right now is I need more debt. Right? So part of what we began doing in 2010 going forward was to find ways in which we could address the issue of the viability of food businesses, the viability of increasing the local regional food economy. Early on in that process, around 2011, 2012, I made the connection with Audrey Morell. At the time, she was the Associate Dean at the College of Business Administration at Pitt. And she also ran a thing called the David Berg Center, which was actually a social impact center, basically, that was designed specifically to address the issue of the intersection between business and social benefit. Right. And so we started talking about farming, and there was farming and the food economy. Another person that got involved in that conversation was Ann Dugan. I don't know if have you run into Ann? Do you know Ann? Mm-hmm. So at the time, Ann was running the Small Business Development Center at Pitt. And she had a special project that she had decided to take on, which was dealing with the whole issue of succession ownership problems with farms. And what she found out was what everybody has since talked about, which is that as the people that own the farms begin to age out, getting a successor for that farm becomes harder and harder. It becomes more problematic. And so there becomes a whole lot of challenges in that area. And that's why you see so much consolidation, even among family farms. So the farm census comes out one year and there's 4 farms, and the farm census comes out the next cycle, and there's just as much acreage being farmed, but there's only 2 farms that are running that acreage because it is what it is, right? And so people get out of the business and they basically turn over their land under a land lease usually, or some shared agreement essentially with the farmer next door to them, and that's how that works out. So she was involved in that conversation as well. And so that started this tripping down the highway of life, right, if you will, going through all of this. And in the meantime, Audrey was simultaneously, which I got involved with late in the project, but she was working with Greg Bullis, and they did a thing called the Food Abundance Index. The big discussion back then and today is food deserts, right? And more, there's much more awareness today than there ever has been. The term food desert was not really appropriately applied because it really doesn't, first of all, it doesn't speak to the assets and the resiliency and the self-sustainability of these communities. It actually treats them like somehow they've just been turned into deserts because they don't have a supermarket in them. I'm reading a book right now, which was actually, it's called Black Food Geography, and the writer Ashante Reese moved into this neighborhood in northeast Washington, D.C., which was classically defined as a food desert. And what she did was she went around the entire neighborhood and began to do interviews with people, map the supermarkets, but she's also introducing it from a cultural perspective and from a geopolitical perspective, so that you begin to understand these things not as being one or two dimensional, but as being multi-dimensional communities. And sustainability and resiliency, which are two key terms that are not usually associated with the term food desert, are actually much more at the heart of solving this problem, quite honestly, because it empowers the community basically to take control of their own lives and in this case, take control of their food system. And Audrey was putting that together way back when with the Food Abundance Index. I think even before there was a lot of discussion about this in terms of the literature and people doing a lot of deep thinking about what was wrong about the food desert dilemma. But of course, the term caught fire and the USDA had it all over the place, and every major academic institution was looking at food deserts, measuring food deserts. And as you know, because you did a lot of work in this space, what you found out in Pittsburgh is that there were a lot of communities that maybe weren't food deserts, but they were underserved communities and they had lack of access, and there was food inequality. But food inequality generally went hand in hand with other issues like health inequality and transportation inequality and income inequality, right? Same thing, and to not acknowledge that is to really underscore why it doesn't get fixed. Because we work in most of these problem areas, particularly food, in what we could consider to be silos. So when you go to Harrisburg, for example, there's nobody in Harrisburg that is working across the entire spectrum of the food economy, which is another lesson that I began to learn as I was going through this process of discovering what was going on in the food industry. So if you think about it, if, for example, you're the Department of Community and Economic Development in Harrisburg, and good people, right? And they perceive everything in the context of business viability. Well, if I told you that there were 12,000 small businesses in Western Pennsylvania that were at risk of failure on any given day, somebody in Harrisburg would set their hair on fire trying to come up with a solution. It just turns out that those 12,000 businesses happen to be family-owned farms, right? But because
no burning hair.
No burning hair. No burning hair. We're fine.
Oh, just them.
just them. Oh, well, they're farmers. It's a lifestyle.
They like being poor.
They like being poor and underserved. And then when you try to draw the wider circle and say, well, when you take a look at these farms and then you take a look at the people in that region's economy, in a place like, say, Johnstown, or a place like, say, Greensburg, or a place like, say, or where we have people like working in like Crabtree, right, in Westmoreland County. Well, there's a whole bunch of businesses that are interwoven into and interdependent with the farm economy. They're not running farms, but they depend upon somebody being out there doing it, whether it's equipment repair, sales, seed, manufacturing, processing, waste removal, yada, 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 right? You just kind of go down the whole list. So, kind of thinking about my life's journey coming from that one point of inflection, because my daughter made me have to think about it in 2010 to 2023. That's kind of how I've been sort of reassembling my thought process and thinking about what is and not just doing something glib like saying, oh, the food ecosystem. Okay, what does that mean? Well, and so we really began to think about that, and I began to think about that intentionally in terms of going and changing the idea that when you deal with that system, you look at it like a supply chain, but you look at it like a value supply chain. In other words, and I made this comment, the first time I made this comment, I was at a conference, I think down in New Orleans with the group. And I said, you do realize that every community in the United States, and in the world for that matter, has all of the core elements of a food ecosystem. You don't have to go out and find them. They're already there doing business in these spaces, whether it's the distribution, logistics, farming, production, waste removal, retail, grocery, restaurants, culinary. They all exist simultaneously in your community, and it doesn't matter where your community is. And the reason why that's important is because for the most part, when we start talking to the people that are actually supposed to be doing something about this, they typically don't understand that all those assets are in some form or another already in existence in their communities. And so they don't spend their time concentrating on organizing those assets to talk to one another. They go outside of the community and try to bring in somebody from the outside to fix a problem in that value chain that they perceive. So if you think about it, grocery is a great example. So, not recognizing that basically there are people that are responsible for aggregating food, putting it on a truck and delivering it to a grocery store actually exist within your service area. They exist within your neighborhood environment, right? And you fly right over them and you try to talk to somebody else in the world of food logistics in order to address this issue of getting a grocery store in your community, right? As opposed to trying to organize the resources that you could build a more community-centric grocery store that also has an interdependency with the people that do the distribution and the delivery and the aggregation and on and on, right? That's an important realization that people need to have about the food system, it seems to me, is that people don't think about it in the historical context, and they also don't think about how new this is. So when I was a kid growing up, and that was way before you were born, so we'll talk about that. But when I was a kid growing up, 90% of what we had as consumers came from within about a 200-mile radius of where we lived. And it didn't matter if we were in Chicago, which is where I was, or Pittsburgh, or anywhere else, right? 60-70% of all the processed meats in your region came from local processors. And those processors basically got 60 to 70% of their meat product from local farms.
And you're talking about like butchers,
butchers,
for like not like making sausage. Or
well, even the
meat,
sausage guys. I mean,
yeah.
every major. Think about it.
True.
Every town that you go to in Pennsylvania and Ohio, let's use those examples. And I knew this because I was involved with the acquisition and the reorganization of Uncle Charlie's Sausage Company. And what I learned was that when you go around the country, every region has their own regionally identifiable sausage brand. So Uncle Charlie's has got a very high profile recognition by consumers in Western Pennsylvania, but there's just as much of a high profile sausage company that's located in the greater Northeast Ohio Cleveland market. And you could go up to Syracuse, same thing, right? So, and those are small producers. Small Silver Star Meats is a great example of that. Silver Star Meats over in McKees Rocks for years and years and years was one of the only places that you could get some of the most exotic, like Eastern European styled sausages and bloodwurst and all that other stuff that they would do, nobody else would do, right? But they did that from a context of having that market right by their store. Those consumers were already there, and they knew what they wanted. They knew what drove them towards those recipes and styles of meat and all that other stuff. My wife grew up in Lompoc, California, which nobody knows about. Most people don't. W.C. Fields made it famous one day because he said, "I went to Lompoc once, but it was closed." That was a W.C. Fields line. But she was a military brat, but she introduced me to Santa Maria barbecue, which has got a huge following now all across the United States. Santa Maria was a creation of cattle ranches in the greater Santa Barbara County area. And they created that recipe basically because the tri-tip is a lower grade of meat from the butcher perspective. And that community pioneered in making sure that meat got reused, and it was something that everybody enjoyed, right? And that became Santa Maria barbecue, which is now tri-tip for short, right? But these are all regional concepts, right? In Chicago, Sladkowski's Polish sausage. I mean, you didn't say Polish sausage without saying Sladkowski's. Well, it just so happened that the largest urban Polish population in the world, the second largest, is in Chicago. The first is Warsaw, right? So no surprise that Sladkowski's found a home in the north side of Chicago. Point is that this whole idea of, we are not strangers in the United States to this whole idea of foods that reflect our history and our cultures and our ethnic populations and our experiences. But what begins to change, and this is where you really begin to realize how we got ourselves where we are, is that after World War II, the supermarket industry began to dramatically expand. So independent grocers began to get pushed out. Big supermarket chains began to develop. They were aggregating. They were industrializing the food economy. Right? They moved, like for example, the meat industry in Chicago in the stockyards. Every 5 years would be picked up and moved to someplace further west. So first it was Chicago, and then it was Kansas City, and then eventually it ends up with, CAFO stockyards in Wyoming, right? And so you say, okay, so what was going on? Well, what was going on was that as the organization of the food system got bigger and more industrialized, then they lean towards economies of scale, right? And so they lean towards aggregation. And so you start aggregating and aggregating and aggregating until you end up with, 95% of all the meat in the United States is made by five companies, I think, something like that, right?
On one hand.
On one hand, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody gives it a second thought until we have a pandemic. and then one of those 5 basically closes their slaughter plant in South Dakota, right? And there's about 5 million pigs basically on their way to market that aren't going to market anymore. They're going into a hole in the ground because that entire industry was directed everything into that one processing plant for 50-60% of all the active hog production in the western United States, because our supply chains actually turned out, thanks to the pandemic, to be a lot more fragile than people thought they were. They always were talking about how great this global supply chain was and how robust it was and yada, yada, yada. And then you end up with reality. There was an article written by Temple Grandin, I think, right around the end of the pandemic, 2021 probably. And she said, and you can't argue with Temple Grandin about anything that she talks about. So if you do, you get slapped around. But she said that, anybody with any sense would take at least 25 to 30% of the current active amount of supply in the meat industry and regionalize it. In other words, decentralize it and at least give you some safeguards, some safety railings, right? So that you can assure the fact that there will always be supply in the event that there's a crash of some kind, right? And you could just repeat that analogy to every segment of the food industry, whether it's contamination of romaine lettuce or right. We kind of go down the list. Now we have this huge problem in Florida because it turns out that the orange crop is at serious risk because of environmental changes. Well, we're 70% dependent on Florida oranges for orange juice in the United States, at least conservatively. So those kinds of things really sort of jump out at you and you begin to think about it and you think about the big picture, but then the challenge is, and this is where I try to get myself back into the real world, the challenge is to think about, okay, so what can we do to basically at least show people what the alternative looks like? So back in 2018, we were constantly talking about this kind of stuff and we were kind of flummoxed. I was actually involved in running a company over in Oakmont, Pennsylvania called Hollymead Food Products. We had bought the company in 2016, the Hollymead group did. We bought it because it was a succession situation. The founder had passed away. The oldest son of the founder had also passed away, and the 2 remaining siblings were both college professors, one in Pittsburgh and the other in Indiana, and neither one of them wanted to come back and run the business. And so they put the company up for sale, but there was no obvious buyer because it was a pretty small niche company. We had about $3 million in top line sales, but it was really a niche. And what we did was we made par-baked pizza crusts. One of our big customers, actually, if your listeners are from Pittsburgh, they'll know. One of our biggest customers was Fox Pizza, and had been since Fox opened their doors. Right? We did a par-baked crust. We did it in a way that nobody else did, and we didn't really have any serious competition because it was such a small segment of the industry. We were doing all that, and by the way, the other thing that I really have enjoyed doing in this, getting involved in the business side of things as opposed to the academic side of it, is when you are working and running and operating a food company, you also get to see how the food company interacts with all the other food companies and all the other pieces within the food system, right? So when we bought Tom and Eddie's and we were looking at the company, we noticed and this is again a very small company, and we had a small freezer for storage, and we had like a one door loading dock, right? And so we were sitting up in the offices, the administrative offices, and we were talking to the owners and the guys that were running the company. And I looked out the window, and every 10 minutes there was another 52-foot, 42, 45-foot, whatever trailer pulling up, and each trailer had a different name on it, right? So trailer number 1 was Cisco. Trailer number 2 was U.S. Food Service. Trailer number 3 was PenMac. Trailer number 4 was, you went down this list, and I said, how many distributors are we selling to at this little tiny, nobody knows we're here, frozen pizza crust place? And the general manager said, we do business with about 45 different distribution companies all the time. Now, for people that don't understand the dynamics of the food industry, most people that are manufacturing food are not in the business of taking what they manufacture and sending it directly to the end market, like a grocery store chain. They go through a distributor, or they go through a broadline distributor, like Cisco's a broadline distributor. And they cover the United States. U.S. Food Service covers the United States. But then you've got regional and family-owned distributors in places like Pittsburgh, like Monteverdi, and you've seen their trucks, right? Curtsy up in Erie. These are all family-owned businesses. And what you begin to realize is that you, as the operator of a manufacturing company, your first task is to really get to know those guys, because those are the guys that you're selling to. You think you're a big shot and you're selling your pizza crust to that end market, you're not. That's what the distributor's doing. And the only way you're going to find out more about your end market from a manufacturer's standpoint is to actually spend a lot of time with the distributors, because it's the only way they're going to tell you who they're selling. Unless the end market calls you up and says they have a problem with your product and they need you to replace it. Then you find out that I've been selling you pizza crust. I didn't know that, right? And that's not just true for us. I mean, if you talk to somebody like Scott Baker over at 5 Generation Bakery, which I think you probably will at some point, or some of the other people that are members of the Food and Beverage Network that are going to be on your list, they will tell you the same thing. It doesn't matter what their product is. One of the lessons they learn real quick is they have to understand how to live within that environment and how to work with distributors and wholesalers. That's how product moves from one point to the other, right? If that wasn't there, then it wouldn't happen. You don't have that direct, unless you're selling to a farmer's market, you really don't have a direct access point to that grocery store. You can't go through the front door. You got to go through the back door, or you got to go through the distribution warehouse or whatever. And when you're talking to people in the industry, they begin to explain that to you. The first time they explain it to you, they're like, you really don't know what you're talking about, so we'll sit down and we'll try to explain this to you, because you're really an idiot about this stuff, right? And it's funny, Paul Abbott from Giant Eagle, who we work with very closely, who is the category-wide manager for all of the Market District stores now for the company. Paul and I were talking about this, and he said, Joe, he said, one of the hardest things we have to explain to people that think they've got a really great product and they're going to take it into the store is that they're not selling that product through the door at retail. They have to account for the fact that there's at least 2 touches on that product before it gets to the shelf, right? And so they have to be prepared to basically figure that out in terms of their price structure and their profitability and what's their cost of goods and their net operating income and their margins and all that good stuff that goes into this calculation, right? Well, that, as you know, because you've talked to enough of these people, that sometimes can be a life-changing experience for them, because they say, well, I get $10 a jar at the farmer's market. And they said, good. Giant Eagle's going to give you 6. Well, they're taking advantage of me. Well, no, not really, because they're going to put you also in 95 store locations. So if you want to be that company, right, that's kind of up to you. I mean, that's a choice. Like, you can make that choice. And if you do want to make that choice, then you have to be prepared to deal with the reality of the system. Because it's not taking advantage of you. It's really the way the system is organized in order to move the most amount of product the most efficiently to the end market and do it safely. Right? There's a lot of other ways you can take a look at that, but I think that's on the positive side, that's one of the big takeaways that I have. One of the companies that's been struggling with this since inception is Harvey Farms, because and I've had to explain this to people about Harvey Farms, and they're like, well, Harvey Farms is very expensive. I said, well, yeah, but the reason why it's expensive is because they're offering the people that are providing them the produce and the finished product at a higher price. So in order for them to still make their margin, because they're going to deliver this to your front door and they're going to maintain a platform for ordering this stuff and they're going to keep it in inventory and all that other stuff. So they're going to sell you that dozen eggs. Let's use that as an example, because that's a pretty easy one. So Harvey's going to sell me that dozen eggs from Jubilee Farm for $6.50 a dozen. I can go to Giant Eagle and buy cage-free brown eggs for $3.50. So I have to make a choice. I have to make a conscious choice that it's worth it to me to support Jubilee Farms at $3 more a dozen, right? To do that.
And support Harvey Farms.
And to support Harvey, and allow Harvey to maintain their operations, that they can grow their business. Because the more they grow and the more items they bring into their system, they can begin to also bring those prices down. So when they're a startup, it's a really, what Simon's doing is really awkward, because it's a challenge to get over the hump. I mean, I was in a meeting with somebody who remained nameless, but she's a big deal in terms of regional planning and economic development. And she said, me and my friends, we love Harvey Farms and we wanted to support them, but when I looked at it, I'm paying more for that food than I could pay at Whole Foods.
She doesn't understand.
I said, well, then you're not getting why you should be buying it from Harvey Foods, and that's fundamental, right? And I've had these conversations with Simon, because he's on just to digress a bit, he is on this very important process of training people to understand where their food comes from, why it's important, why we have to support the people who are bringing the food, and how that all works together, right?
Yeah, he's another person who, as a person thinking through food systems and his business, that has had such an evolution, because he's a deep thinker about the system and trying to figure out what's best for it and what's best for people and how to support the farm. So I think his mission is kind of changed over the years, but I think he's stuck with the core of supporting farmers, because the profit margin is so low. But how best to do that, it's still a good question.
Right, exactly right. And that goes back to that initial thought of when we decided to consolidate food system over the last 50 years. And it wasn't like one year we flipped a switch and the food system was consolidated. It was over 50 years or more we industrialized the food system at every level, right? Wholesale, distribution, manufacturing, farming, everything began to get industrialized. And industrialization led to centralization. And in the near term, there's like these benefits that come about because of that. But in the long term, there's all these side effects that affect the viability of our communities, the ability for people to access the food they need when they need it, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting conversation because food is so pivotal to who we are as a community and as a nation. And when you look at that food system as it has evolved, and the evolution follows a lot of other patterns, right? Like, for example, suburbanization. One of the things that drove the growth of the expansion of the supermarket industry was that the fact after World War II, we began to rapidly build suburban communities all around center cities. And that was not by accident, right? But it wasn't like one person was sitting there in the room and said, this is my master plan. But everybody plays their role, right? The federal government finances the construction of highways to move people out of the city faster. You know, the developers begin to realize that there's this opportunity because there's big unmet demand for affordable single-family homes. And they start going after all the land around the cities because there's so much land. Well, the land also happened to be where farms were. And so we begin to eat up all the farmland basically in an area right around Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Chicago and New York and all that, right? And all those things trigger consequences in terms of how the entire system then gets organized. So I guess this is my way of saying, but if you want to change it, you have to realize that deconstructing a system is actually going to be just as hard as constructing the system, right? And it's a long-term project. And this is what I learned from Simon, too. Simon would say the same thing. If you want me to build a food hub or a really advanced, a really high-powered CSA for the greater Pittsburgh market, it's going to take me time to get that 100 vendors this year. I can grow it to 200 vendors next year. I still have to keep paying them competitive prices because otherwise they're not going to come to me. They're going to go to somebody else, right? Then I can grow it to 300 vendors. Now all of a sudden I have purchasing power and I have a growing subscriber base, right? So I think in Simon's case, I think he's at 5,000 subscribers or more right now at Harvey. He started this whole enterprise in 2019, which is incredible. And
we started this iteration of
it bootstrapped
that
it.
he was doing prior to that, because back in 2011, 2012, he was doing the Farmer CSA software. Mm-hmm. And that was
and he said this wasn't cutting it.
He's like, this isn't viable. This isn't the way to save family farms. So it's really interesting.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
So you started this, we'll say, third half of your life, mixing your first two halves together. You worked on Republic Foods and got that. And then was that like just a sort of natural progression to do succession ownership of the farm? Like you said with Uncle Charlie's Sausage and the Tom and Eddie's. Those were businesses that the kids didn't have an interest in carrying on, so you saved them. Were there a lot of those, or did that just kind of happen?
Well, during that transition phase, I ended up back at another investment group. Between 2011 and 2016, I actually helped create a company called FMB Capital, which is now called Ticum Capital. And that was set up as a small business investment company. And so one of the things that we wrote into our business model, not just around food, but just generally, was that as an investment company, we would look to mid-sized existing privately held businesses that either wanted to grow or needed to make a transition in ownership.
Was it food specifically, or any kind of business?
We were agnostic. We were agnostic. So we were looking at everything from people that made car parts to people that made sausage, right? And so it was a pretty broad scan, because our job was to basically get those investment dollars on behalf of our investors out into those projects and then grow them, right? But I began to lean in towards the food space because I knew it pretty well at that point, and I did other deals for them as well. But that's where Uncle Charlie's came in, because I was introduced to Uncle Charlie's by a friend of mine who was an investment banker who was working for the owner. And the owner he was in his late 70s, early 80s, and his wife had medical problems, and the kids didn't want anything to do with the business. And he came to us and said, would you be interested in talking to Uncle Charlie's? And I checked the box and I said, hell yeah, because when you buy Joe Bute's widget company in Timbuktu and you walk into a meeting in Pittsburgh and you say, oh, I'm an investor that invested in Joe Bute's widget company in Timbuktu. And they go, oh, that's nice. But I said, you know what happens when you walk into a room in Pittsburgh and you tell people, we just bought Uncle Charlie's Sausage Company? Bing! The lights are going on. You know, people are saying, you bought Uncle Charlie's, really? Because everybody thinks food is cool, particularly if they know the brand, right? I went through this iteration like 3 or 4 times in different parts of my experience on the investment side. We got involved in past life. I was involved in refinancing the Cozy Shack pudding company. You know Cozy Shack? Mm-hmm. So I met Vinny Grapuzzo. Vinny Grapuzzo was the founder of Cozy Shack in Long Island, right? Food stories are amazing. By the way, food people are amazing people. So Vinny, I gotta tell this story. So Vinny was a bread truck driver in Queens, and because he was a bread truck driver in Queens, he would hit all the delis in Queens. And there are more than a couple delis in Queens, you know, as you probably can imagine. And he used to go with these 2 brothers that owned this place called the Cozy Shack Deli. And Vinny loved rice pudding. He just loved rice pudding, right? And so the story goes, Vinny was on his bread truck route, and he came in and he told these 2 guys, he said, you know, he says, I love your rice pudding. He said, I'd love the recipe, and I'd love to make it and sell it. And those 2 guys said, go ahead, knock yourself out. You know, we don't care. So they gave him the recipe, they gave him the name, they gave him Cozy Shack as a name. He went back up to his place in Long Island, and he started making it out of his garage, which is where everybody starts making their puddings, you know, of course. And he began taking it around. And the key to his success was, I kid you not, the key to his success was that when you looked on the bottom of his container, it had an expiration date. Now, if you know your puddings, when you're buying puddings from, say, Nestle's, Jell-O, whatever, right? That expiration date is maybe 5 years from now because there's so much preservative in that stuff that it's gonna outlive you, right? I mean, that's really, you could use it in Armageddon or something, I don't know. And I've run into this multiple times with food manufacturers who make their food with the least amount of preservatives, one way or another. And the consumer pays attention. And so Cozy Shack pudding got the reputation for being the real thing, like real authentic deli rice pudding and tapioca and all that stuff.
Isn't it in the refrigerated section?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that puts it apart, sets it apart.
Yeah, and you better check it because it will go bad, right? The other company I reference a lot when we're talking about this is actually a little Pittsburgh company called Greek Gourmet. Mike Smallis, who was making his own hummus out of his Greek Gourmet deli over there on Murray Avenue. I forget who introduced me to Mike, but we went in there one time and he made the best gyro sandwiches, by the way. And so I'm still pissed at him that he got rid of the deli, but that's beside the point. But he also made this amazing hummus, right? When hummus was just starting to go like this in terms of consumer interest, it just... Well, Mike's hummus also has an early expiration date on it because, again, he's using all natural, least amount of preservative that you could possibly put into it, and he's using these amazing flavor profiles. And he always contended, and I believe he was right, he always contended that one of the things that made people like the Whole Foods folks want to slot him in their stores was because of that. It was because he basically had the freshest hummus basically in the market. If you go to Peterland, if you buy the Peterland hummus from, I buy it from Harvey, right? Same thing. Peterland's hummus doesn't last forever. You got to actually be thinking about using it. Otherwise, you're going to be really mad at yourself because you didn't eat it fast enough and it ended up in the back of the refrigerator or something. I don't know what it is. But if you buy the stuff that's Sabra, which is one of the top-selling national brands, and you begin to realize that A, it tastes terrible. But B, it has a really, really, really long shelf life. And that actually turns out to matter to consumers, which is it's kind of counterintuitive, right? You think, you'd want to have something that isn't going to spoil in your refrigerator. And it turns out that consumers that are buying food because of the taste profile and because it's something that they enjoy having are also willing to live with the fact that it's not going to last forever. I find that really fascinating. I mean, it's one of those things about consumers and food that's just one of those fascinating realizations is that it doesn't... bourbon is a different story. I mean, bourbon, we're good with bourbon. It could be there.
I think the moral of the story is that people aren't as dumb as we think they are.
Well, that's true. Consumers are much more aware than the average guy in some big national company gives them credit for. So anyways, I'm not sure where I was going with that, other than to say that, this is So this all becomes part of that thinking through what the regional and local food economy should be about and how it works. I believe that in order for you to really engage in the higher level conversation, you also have to know what's going on at the local ground level. You have to know how the system actually works. And if you want to make changes, you have to know how to make those changes and make them effective, right? So I say that because I think, and this is a conversation that we have a lot in the Food21 network, is how do you achieve scale? And this scale always means that everybody in the room has to get bigger, right? I'll give a shout out. This is a Dr. Audrey Morell concept, right? Her opinion has always been that the big mistake that people make in the business schools and the business consultants and the planning guys and everything else is that they don't look at the ability for companies to work collectively together to create scale collectively or in collaboration. Getting to scale means you have a little plant over here. That means you need a big plant over there. That should be your goal, right? And food is one of those things where you can actually achieve scale without necessarily having to build a huge manufacturing facility in order to achieve scale. And I use Cozy Shack as my test case. He was getting national distribution on that rice pudding, and it was all coming out of a relatively small pudding dairy processing plant.
I like pudding plant.
Yeah, a pudding plant.
Pudding plant.
A pudding plant. Yeah, it sounds like a Willy Wonka kind of thing. I'm going to the pudding plant today. And that's different, right? That's different than thinking about you have to be the guys over at Nestle's, or you have to be the guys over, one of the big companies, right? Unilever or something like that. Right? Then you can actually get there without having to do that. You could get to a result where basically people start to identify with that. And I know that's been a big conversation internationally, right? With things like the Slow Food International, for example, and all the work that's been done in terms of thinking about regional food preferences and all that kind of stuff, and maintaining and protecting those identities. Like, why does it matter that San Marino tomatoes can only grow in San Marino? You can't be a San Marino tomato in a can that came out of a field in California. You could be a San Marino-like tomato, but you're not going to be San Marino, right? And that kind of stuff actually also creates, I think, equity, and it creates identity, and it creates a sense of context. People begin to want to know where their food comes from. That's another big, important conversation, I think, that this all represents, which is being able to have a straight line connection between you and where it comes from. I learned that early on in Hollymead. We were working on a project in Wisconsin, which is where I met Rick Terrian. Rick was at the time running a thing called the Wisconsin Innovation Kitchen. And Rick will be the first one to tell you that he didn't know what he was doing. He said he's not a food guy, he was a software and tech guy. But he and I were in these planning meetings about talking to build a network of, this is when food hubs were really sort of starting to take off. And we started talking about creating a hub of hubs, so that all the hub developers in Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania could begin to start communicating with each other. We never got to the next level, which I really wanted to get to, which is what would happen if we began to build a food trading association and created actually a food ecosystem that connected all of those hubs and all of those aggregators. I got inspired by the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. They, to me, were the role model for this, because they took all of these small family farms in the South and organized them into a producer cooperative, and then they would go to market. They would also manage things like, this was a banner year for watermelons, for example, and now we got all these watermelons that we need to dump, right? And the Federation would actually go north and take truckloads of watermelons and get them sold into northern markets, basically, so that the farmers weren't stuck there with watermelons that they couldn't sell and ended up having to let them sit there and rot, right? So more importantly, when I was in Wisconsin, I got a chance to meet the people from CROP. CROP is the cooperative organization that you and I know as Organic Valley. And CROP started out actually as a vegetable cooperative, not a dairy cooperative. Organic vegetables. They began to think about it from the organic milk perspective, because there was no organic milk at the time going into major retail chains of any kind whatsoever. It wasn't a thing, right? And the number of creameries and dairy operations that could actually handle organic milk and claim it could be certified were like, you could count them on one hand in most states. I think for the longest time, the closest organic dairy in western Pennsylvania was actually in southwestern New York. And they had to truck it all the way up there in order to get it. But they came up with a brilliant idea, which is that if you were buying a carton of their milk in a supermarket, on the side of the carton would be a picture of the farmer and where he lived, right? No other identifying information like, your social security number or anything like that. But, but basically saying this milk came from this farm, and others like him who are members of this cooperative And oh, by the way, that's why you're going to pay more for it, because they had to go into supermarkets, which is not an easy thing to do, and explain to the supermarkets that you're going to pay about $2 more a gallon for this milk than the rest of the milk sitting here, and you're going to like it when we do this, right? And that was not an easy sell to begin with. There's been several case studies written about Organic Valley, which are fascinating. One of which was when they turned down Walmart. Because Walmart said, we'll take it all and we'll sell it at, and they said, no, we're not interested in diluting our brand by selling it through Walmart. You're gone, just leave, just go away. We're not interested in talking to you. That's not our program.
Yeah, people don't understand the Walmart model and how it's just been so detrimental to so many brands.
Right. Those kinds of things become informative about how we think about our regional food ecosystem and our economy, because I think you have to operate, if you want to be impactful in this, you got to operate at both levels. You got to appreciate the fact that what people are doing here in terms of the actual making, processing, selling, shipping, they've all got to make a living doing it. This is not a charitable enterprise. Audrey likes to say, this is a food economy, right? The emphasis on economy, right? And the reason why that's important is because a lot of the early stage development around local and regional food systems, as you know, and as I fully appreciate, were coming from people that didn't want to think about it as an economy. They wanted to think about it as a statement or as a lifestyle, or as, wouldn't it be great if we all did it this way, right? And you're like, yeah, but if you're not making a profit doing it, it's not going to last very long. And so what are we talking about? It got to the point where it got a little bit heated and ideological, as you might recall. We've had some meetings about that, where, you have to think about the economic reality of this. It's just like the conversation with Simon, right? Simon has to take heat from people that think, well, why are you charging me that much for a dozen eggs when I can get a dozen eggs from Whole Foods cheaper? And it's like, okay, but I'm not Whole Foods. And you have the opportunity to go down a list of offerings in our website every week. And we show you the stuff that's in season, the stuff that's fresh, and we can tell you the story on every item on that list and where it came from. And Whole Foods can't do that, right? If that doesn't matter to you, fine, then you should spend all your money at Whole Foods. That's just who you are. But it becomes a difficult argument to make when people are sort of challenging you that, well, people need this food for free.
Yeah. One of my biggest pet peeves is the free farmer's market. I was like, can we not call it a farmer's market? Because the farmer is not getting paid if we're giving it away for free, and that is not a good thing to perpetuate. It's maddening to me. But yeah, capitalism is a hard thing to have with idealism and with... Because the local food movement is trying to impart a little bit of the idea of food sovereignty as a model, but it's really expensive. So it's kind of not necessarily reaching its audience in some regards. And I think that message is missed, like, by your friend who's like, why would I buy this from Harvey when I could just go to Whole Foods? Well, because then you're dependent on Whole Foods. Yeah, food system is really, really complicated.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, a good friend of mine who's passed away, who you knew, Rich Dieter. Rich always used to say this about musicians. It's great to have an artist incubator, but the artists also have to be able to sell the art. And people have to understand that. They have to be prepared to pay for the art.
The laborers that are out there harvesting our food can't afford that food.
They can't afford the food.
Yes. I don't trust capitalism. This is probably exactly what it was designed to do.
Well, the reality is that we have to recognize the value that you're asking somebody to get, this is where this gets back to this whole idea of the industrialization of the food system. One of the implicit benefits of industrialization and mass production is you lower the cost per item through mass production, right? So if that's the goal, then what you've done is you've trained all of us as consumers. It's look, I mean, we how many years have we been going through this with the whole fair trade thing with garments and clothing made in child labor sweat camps in Bangladesh and Vietnam, right? But I don't want to pay that much for a shirt. I don't want to pay that much for a shirt. If you paid fairly for the shirt, that $5 t-shirt would be worth $20. Well, I don't want to spend that much. Well, okay, so then what you're doing is you're empowering the people that basically can exploit labor in a place that you're not looking at. Same way with your vegetables. Same way with your, go on and on and on, right? We should get it cheaper because, and you're asking them to do something that you wouldn't do for yourself. You wouldn't want to be treated that way, right? I mean, I think Henry Ford's line was, if I don't pay these people a decent wage, they're not going to be able to afford to buy my cars. And I'm putting a lot of people to work here. That's a lot of car buyers, right? They're, It's kind of makes sense, and you'd think that would be kind of obvious to people, but that's not how people look at it. I mean, look what we're going through now with just paying teachers a living wage, and you got to go down the list. Healthcare work during the pandemic.
But with teachers, there's no product.
Well, that is true. Healthcare workers, and I know the grocery store workers have said this too, that, there was a time when everybody said that they were an essential worker during the pandemic. They were all essential.
Oh, yeah. Now, how do we treat it?
Now the pandemic's over, and you're not essential anymore. So, but then they're scratching their head trying to figure out why they can't get people to come to work there. Well, because you want to go back to the wage scale that you were paying before the pandemic, and nobody wants to work for that anymore. And
now they don't feel so special.
Now they don't feel so special anymore, right? So it is kind of a dilemma, because the system always wants to, as long as you define labor as a cost and not a value add, then that's the way you treat it. Somebody did it. There was a Dilbert cartoon or something that I saw once about, the boss said, he was at an employee meeting, he said, people are our greatest assets. And Dilbert said something like, so we're being depreciated? The idea being that if I'm an asset, under bookkeeping rules, you're going to keep depreciating me as a human being until I'm worth nothing, right? And when I get to that point, then you're like, you're gone. Okay, we're through with you now.
Wow.
It's pretty interesting insight,
Yeah.
Right? People are our greatest.
Absolutely.
If I'm an asset, then I'm on the balance sheet and I'm going to be depreciated year over year, right? I'm constantly being depreciated. I'm not being rewarded. And it is funny in work, in all of our jobs, in all of our professions, we see that with people that, why is it so easy to get rid of the people that have been there the longest? When the people who've been there the longest know the most about what it is that they're doing, right?
I see it all the time.
And it's like, well, he's 50 years old. I mean, he's like, we can all tell those stories, unfortunately. So when all this comes fast forward to Food21, we started thinking about how all these things fit together back in 2018, 2019. And we had an invitation from Morgan O'Brien, who was at the time the CEO of People's Gas. He was concerned that People's didn't understand the intersection between food and energy, and what should they be thinking about as an energy company as it related to food. It started out basically as being a fairly straightforward conversation about what the Dutch were doing in the Netherlands and using natural gas to essentially literally power up their entire food economy, right? And make themselves the largest food exporter in Europe and maybe the number 2 or number 3 exporter in the world, next to the United States in terms of value-added product and crops. So we went to work on that, but then we came back to him and I said, well, we'd like to modify the scope. And let's think about it from the perspective of what is your self-interest as a business in the utility space. Well, if there are no businesses doing business in Pittsburgh, then you don't have anybody to sell gas to. And one of the biggest segments of the Pittsburgh economy are actually food-related businesses, whether they're restaurants, pizza shops, manufacturing, distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And so we said, if it's okay with you, we'd like to expand this study to include the whole value chain proposition that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. And he was the kind of guy who would say, yeah, let's do that. That sounds pretty interesting too. So we went ahead and did that. We did a report that basically broke it out into 3 segments. One was to talk about the role of what we now call controlled environment agriculture, which is all things having to do with growing plants indoors or inside and being able to do it on a year-round consistent basis. And that's aquaponics, hydroponics, aeroponics, it's all that stuff, right? And there's no question that some derivative of that entire industry is going to become one of the most important developments that we have right now in terms of preserving our ability to feed ourselves. As Greg Bullis once said to me when we were in a debate with some folks at your alma mater, shall remain nameless, and they were complaining about how vertical agriculture uses fossil fuel and it's not off the grid and it's artificial light and da-da-da-da-da. And Greg said to this audience, and he did it in a totally Greg Bullis kind of way, he said, I'm a farmer. And every day I go out there and I grow things and I make food and make all that happen. He says, but there's one thing I learned in life. It's like, one thing you don't really want to have in this world is a lot of hungry people. Because that's fundamentally really dangerous, right? And he said, and I think that we're steering into a situation globally where it's going to become progressively harder for people to be able to feed the population of this planet without having to do something like this in order to supplement and expand the possibilities, right? And so when you see where all the CEA activity is globally, it's in places like China around their central cities. It's in the Middle East. It's all over, one form or another. The U.S. has been a little bit slow getting out of the gate, but it's clearly starting to take shape, and they've had some successes and some failures, but we'll see more of it. Anyways, so we wrote that section based on what we knew about CEA, and we had a guy who really knows his way around that space, who was one of our advisors. He's still actively looking at building a series of these things using aquaponics, basically using aquaculture and aquaponics as his primary method for growing the produce inside the system. Second thing we looked at was the value chain and the food system and the food economy. And that had to do with all the food-related businesses, where we are, what's the importance of food businesses, of food enterprises within this geographic area. And then based on that, what should we do to enhance them and grow them and expand them, right? How does that segment of the economic activity in this region grow? And then we got to the third section, and that's when we all sat down and said, okay, so how do we end this thing? And I had the bright idea. I said, well, what they did in Europe, they started food institutes, which is true. The big players in European food economy, like Barilla, for example, in the pasta space, they all underwrite these open source, open networking institutes where people could come together and come up with new ideas and new ways to think about organizing the food economy from top to bottom, right? Nothing like you would see at, say, Penn State School of Agriculture. Right? But really, it's industry, government, and academic and scientific research all sort of focused together, and just about every country has at least one or more of these institutes that function. So I said, okay, so let's do an institute. And we went back and met with Morgan and began talking about it. And he says, great. He says, I love this. And he said, so what's your thinking on the institute? And I was like, I don't know. We had to end it. we had to give you an idea. We had to have a segue. And he says, I like that. He said, go do that. So we actually agreed that we would try to go do that. And of course, we named it, when we did the white paper, we called it Food21. So brilliantly, in the world of branding, what we did is we kept Food21, and that's what we called the organization.
And Food21 is the 21st
century.
Gotcha. Okay. I kind of knew that. But yeah.
Yeah. I had to explain that to a couple of people, so you're pretty quick. That's good.
Thank you.
So when we got to focus on that, then we began thinking about how we wanted to organize this center of activity, and we had some thoughts on that. One is it should be focused on taking advantage of leveraging and connecting and increasing the amount of intersections between everybody in the group. In other words, what I would call asset-based community development, right? So you don't try to create a new class of assets. You actually go out there and try to reconfigure or change or adjust the fact that what we talked about earlier, all these assets exist within silos and they don't communicate very well with each other. So what would happen if you started going this way as opposed to going vertically, right? And so that became a guiding principle. A second guiding principle is that we need to really come up with ideas that essentially increase the amount of diversity and inclusivity in the food system, because it is neither of those things. And the people that could benefit the most from an active growing food economy typically are on the outside looking in from an economic, jobs, business development perspective, right? Ironically, even though a significant number of the small business startups in the food space in this region are 50, 60, 70% women-owned businesses, and probably 30, 40% people of color. So it actually turns out that it's one of the best sectors in the economy, that if you want to change the rules and increase the amount of inclusivity in the economy, you should start with food. Food and hospitality shouldn't be an afterthought. It actually should be your first thought, because robotics and biopharma and whatever you got, right, ain't gonna get you there. It's just not gonna happen, right? Or it's gonna be really, really a long time waiting. So we're gonna go in that space. So what we did was we started bringing together a group of people that we all knew, and we had a kick-ass formational group. Our founders included Meredith Grelly from Wiggle Whiskey, obviously Audrey Morell came on board with us, Penny Zacharias, who was an attorney with McGuire Woods. She's amazing. So we put together this sort of eclectic group that represented makers. We brought in Rita Resick from Laurel Vista to become our resident farm expert initially to kind of kick it all off, right? And so we had all those dimensions of the economy basically represented, the system represented in the formational board. And that was 2019. That was February of 2019 when the board met for the first time. By 2021, I want to say, So even with the pandemic, we found a way to basically keep bringing people into the organization by creating the second class of people that were called senior advisors. So we had a governing board of directors, and we said, we're not going to expand the governing board of directors because it's a governing board of directors, and all they need to do is sit down and meet 3 or 4 times a year and make sure that everything is being done legally and correctly, and we have a budget and all that. We made a decision we weren't going to hire full-time staff, so everybody that works for the organization typically is coming in as an independent contractor, and that seems to have worked out pretty good. And there's no career development in this organization from that perspective. Everybody that ends up working as an independent contractor brings with them a certain set of life skills and experiences that's additive to the process, right? So think about people like Vince Mangini. Vince is now heading up everything that we're doing in ag. He has a farm out in Crabtree in Westmoreland County, and he knows everybody who's anybody basically in that community from a farming perspective. And he's a terrific networker because he comes out of the investment world. He actually was a business development guy for a couple private equity funds. And he's Italian, so that's another thing. I mean, you just got to take that into consideration. What can I say? So when you take a look at the folks that are kind of circling around that group from a payee perspective, that means there's no long-term contractual obligations or anything like that. It's all based on resources and program and focus, right? The senior advisor group started out basically maybe about 10 people. We started, like the first time we did it, we sort of said, oh, let's do this, this, and this. We're now up to over 30 senior advisors in the organization. So when you go to our website and you take a look at that at food21.org, what you'll see is not only will you see 30 names, but then when you go behind those pictures and check out their bios, they really touch on just about every industry segment that you could possibly think of in terms of expertise, whether it's in health and safety, wellness, community faith-based development. Meredith is still on board as our expert on distilled spirits, It's important to always have somebody there with distilled spirit background. And you put all these folks into a room, which we do once a year, and you kind of brainstorm about where are we and where should we be going and what should be our next big area of focus. And then the third element of this is that basically what we've done is then, as we go through this process, we identify targets of opportunity where we can actually intervene in that. Think about that value supply chain model, that circle of everything that goes through the value system. And then you think about Food 21 in the middle of that, and sort of jutting out into that supply chain and say, there's a gap here, there's an opportunity here, there's something there. And then again, try to organize and configure a bunch of assets that are really already in existence. You're not inventing a new thing, but you configure them in such ways that they accomplish something. A great example of that is, because it's really top of mind for me, is we spent the last 2.5 years trying to figure out how to take advantage of the craft beer industry. Now, the craft beer industry, as you know, and you've probably reported on, is one of the fastest growing food and beverage related business segments in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, I think, is either number 2 or number 3 in terms of the number and volume of craft beer brewers and brewing activity, dollars and cents, right? I think it's somewhere between a $6 to $7 billion industry for Pennsylvania. Maybe it's more. Now think about this from the point of view of, okay, so we know what it is. We know what beer is, right? We know that it's made with all natural raw materials, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have it. It only has like 3 major ingredients other than water, which is malt, hops, and yeast, right? Throw in a little salt and sugar. So we said, okay, so what's the opportunity here in this context? We had a really interesting meeting. We were doing some exploratory on this with a guy named Dan Conroy. Dan Conroy is the co-founder of Great Lakes Brewing Company. He and his brother, Phil. And so we're sitting in the room and we said, so Dan, he said, you're like Mr. Local. Everything you do, a cafe that you have over there in the West End, west side of Cleveland, it's all local. Talk about local farmers and local this and local that. He said, yeah. He said, Joe, he said, the only thing local about my beer is the water. At that point, I didn't know very much about this space other than to say, is there an opportunity there? And he said, look, if you guys can figure out a way to create a scalable source of locally raised, locally processed, locally grown, high quality malt and hops for the beer industry, because right now all of our malt is coming either from Germany or it's coming from Canada and the upper Midwest. And all of our hops are either coming from Germany or they're coming from the Pacific Northwest. He said, so my people are always getting on a plane and flying out to the Yakima Valley to find out about what hops they want to have, or they're flying up to meet with malt houses up in southern Canada, right? He said, if we can begin to move people to the local side of this conversation in the beer industry, we could actually begin to build a vertically integrated regional ingredient economic system for beer. And he wasn't the first person that taught me that lesson. Actually, the first person was Meredith Crowley, who made an absolute firm commitment that she was going to do all of her spirits using organic rye from Pennsylvania. And I was in a meeting with her early on when we were putting Food21 together, and I was asking her about that. And she said, I basically buy all of the organic rye in Pennsylvania. Nobody has got a shot at any organic rye because we take it all, right? And that was before she really began to grow the business even to a larger extent. So when you think about that, and you think about how fundamental malt is to the making of beer, it's not an easy flip the switch because brewmasters have their own peculiar points of view. And once they get into a set supply relationship with somebody, like a malt house in North Dakota, generally, they're not going to just drop it for somebody that they don't know. So you got to figure out a way basically to sort of break in. So Vince Mangini basically took it on himself to plant our first attempt to grow barley like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago.
Is it just a crop that's just not grown because there's
it's
no
grown.
market for it?
No. Barley's grown all the time because barley is a cover crop.
Ah, okay. We just don't harvest it.
You're not harvesting it for malt.
Okay.
And there's at least two types there's more than two, but there's 2-row and 6-row barley. 2-row is preferred for malting, but the farmers are basically either growing it for feed or they're growing it for no-till agriculture. And then you get into a lot of infinite variability based on the seed stock that you're using, and it creates a different grade of malt depending on what you want. It creates a different flavor profile and yada, yada, yada. It goes right down this. So we did some work. We found out that the Penn State had been doing research on barley for ages. And they kept saying, we could really grow barley here for the beer industry. We really could do it, And of course, nobody's paying any attention because it's Penn State. And they can't seem to get out of their own way in terms of getting to the next stage, which is commercialization, right? But one of the pieces of data that we picked up on when we went through this, and I know this is kind of minutia, but it's kind of an interesting story. So one of the pieces of data that we picked up on was that barley is very climate sensitive, and so if you're planting winter barley, there's only certain parts of the Commonwealth that you should be planting that for highest yield, as opposed to summer barley, spring barley, right? Well, it turned out southwestern Pennsylvania was a winter barley zone. Now, thinking about this in terms of our goal to get income into the hands of farmers, well, farmers who have summer seasonal crop in their rotation let the field go fallow in the fall and then replant in the spring. If they can get cash off that field at the end of the winter period and turn that into a cash crop, now they're getting cash crop 12 months a year.
It's a whole extra harvest.
You get a whole extra harvest, and you get the benefits of no-till. You get all of that, that carbon sequestration, all that jazz, right? So we tried it out, and we said, well, we can't take Penn State's word for it, So we did a summer, and they were right. Summer sucked. The yield was pathetic, right? So then we took another shot at it, and we planted. We bought the seed, and we talked to the guys that do the malting in the area. There's only one malter in southwestern Pennsylvania, and that's CNC Malt, and they're up in Butler. So anyways, we did the second round, and it turned out it was right. We got it done. We malted it. And Vince took it over to All Saints Brewery, which is a small craft brewery outside of Greensburg. It was founded by a couple guys from St. Vincent's. Everything, by the way, revolves around St. Vincent's. So these two guys were probably members of his lacrosse team at St. Vincent's, and it's a long story. So we said, would you guys be willing to do a small batch run and run this? And they took a shot at it, and we made our first beer with it at All Saints. It was called Old Hannistown, because Hannistown is a historical monument fort during the French and Indian War. And they were able to get their hops from the Thomas Jefferson National Forest. So it really was pretty close to being a regional local beer, and it tasted pretty good, right? So we felt that justified going to the next level and ramping it up to more production and higher yields and more volume and all that other kind of stuff. So as we went through that process, we said, we really need somebody who's going to take a bunch of malt. And so that's a technical term, by the way, a bunch of malt. But we really needed to take a couple tons off of our hands, and so it's significant from a dollars and cents standpoint, and we have something to demonstrate. So we were in a conversation with Paul Abbott from Giant Eagle. And Paul, for some strange reason, Paul actually loves what we do. I've known Paul for a long time before we were ever in this space, because he was always sort of the center aisle go-to guy for Giant Eagle for local product to go on the shelf. So I knew where his heart was, at least. I knew where his head was at. And Paul said, well, why don't we do it? So the progression of conversations then went from Paul to his people over in the beer and beverage section of the store, the guys that managed the beer department over there. And then it turned out that Giant Eagle was already in conversations with the folks over at Pittsburgh Brewing Company that were getting ready to open finally this huge state-of-the-art brewery over there in Creighton. And I mean state-of-the-art. I mean, this brewery it's worth a tour, and it's worth an interview with the people over there, because they spared no expense. I mean, this is all state-of-the-art brewing equipment, and it's amazing. But they not only are they brewers, but they're not just thinking about themselves in terms of the context of just narrowly defining themselves in terms of making more Iron City, but also making it a contract beer manufacturing center so that they can actually do both joint product development and contract manufacturing for other breweries, right? So they were thinking ahead. How do they utilize this space? How do they utilize this beautiful equipment? And how do they make something happen? So they got into the conversation. And then we spent the next 6 months working on the branding, the labeling, the recipe, and all that stuff. And as of Labor Day weekend, we released our beer, which is called Harvest PA. It's a Helles beer, Helles, which is kind of like a summerish flavor to it. It's pretty light, and it's exclusive to Giant Eagle. So Giant Eagle was this sole point of distribution. So they're Market District, Giant Eagle stores, and Get-Go, right? And then Pittsburgh Brewing slapped our name all over it on the can. So when you buy the can, there's the whole story of where the malt came from and why it's there, and what's Food21 doing with this stuff. And in the midst of all this, we also established a brand for ourselves, which we call Allegheny Mountain Malt, which has been trademarked. And so now we control that brand and that brand identity, so that we've created a regional identity for this product going into the marketplace. While all that was going on, then we met with another company called Zilka. And if you've ever run into Zilka, but Zilka is a wholesale bakery goods distributor. So they do flour, they do yeast, they do all the potassium bromate. I mean, everything that goes into the baking process basically comes out of their warehouse. And then they sell that product to all of these bakeries all over Pennsylvania and Ohio, right? We got introduced to them through the guy who runs CNC Malt, the guys that are maltsters. They said, you should talk to these guys because they're very interested in malt now. And so we sat down with the owners of Zilka, which is a very well-established family-owned business, does all this stuff. And they said, we were going to the bakery goods conventions, and all of the guys that we work with, our peers, were saying, are you guys in the malt business? And they said, no, why would we be? He said, are you kidding? So they were talking about how they've developed contracts with malt companies that are bringing malt into their distribution centers, and then their drivers and salespeople are going out. And because he said, look, every time your truck leaves the warehouse, you know how many breweries you're driving by on your way to the bakery? And I really hadn't thought of that, right? But I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. He said, so we can stop and sell malt to all these craft breweries. Why not, right? And we don't have a lot of competition necessarily. They buy from a lot of national brokers to get their malt, typically. And they had already signed a contract with a British malt manufacturer that was coming into the United States through them. So we became their exclusive local malt for Zilka and Company in this process.
That's wild.
And so now they're taking this place to Hellstown, and they're taking it to Straub, and they're taking it to Bute Brewery. And of course, there's a long tail to this story, right? Because again, nobody's ready to flip the switch and take your malt and throw anything out. So this is going to take some time, right? But Vince came up with a brilliant idea, by the way, on this whole thing, which he's good at the brilliant idea thing. He said, what would happen if we convinced them to take our malt and make it part of their base malt, and then help them with the branding so that they can say that part of that base malt that was actually grown locally and supports Western Pennsylvania agriculture? It doesn't have to be all of it. We don't need 80% of that. We could just live with 20% of it. So that's leading to a lot of interesting conversations, like with North Country, which is a pretty decent-sized craft brewery up in Slippery Rock. Bute, which is growing like crazy in terms of the number of stores they're opening up. Hellstown took over the old Rivertown operation over near Murraysville. So, I mean, the numbers look pretty good. I think, though, at the end of the day, I wasn't saying this is where we're going to stop. I think it did what we wanted it to do, which was basically tell the story of what a regional value chain looks like, and in a way that's really easy for somebody to understand it without getting into a lot of complexity. You can see all of the moving parts. And like I said, these are all parts that already exist, right? The brewery's already in existence. Zilka as a distributor is already in existence. The farmers are already in existence planting barley. They're just not making any money off of it. The malt store is up in Butler, was looking for more product that they can malt. The missing piece was having somebody connect all those dots and connect them so that they're all working in sync with each other, right? And that's what we did.
I want to ask, what's next for Food21? Do you have anything you want to talk about? What's coming up? Any sort of nuggets that you're mulling over?
Yeah, there's one in particular that I think people would be interested in. So I mentioned to you before Rita Resick. So Rita's active with us on a number of levels. Rita knows that we've been pounding on Giant Eagle's door and saying, you guys need to be a serious player in supporting a local beef industry, right? And there isn't one. I mean, right now it's just customized beef growing on somebody's farm like Logan Farm or something like that, and then they sell you a freezer pack, and that's the end of it, right?
But not through the grocery.
But not through
stores,
not through
direct,
grocery
yeah.
channels, right? And not doing anything that really substantially increases the herd size for the region. Rita had a friend in eastern PA, in Lancaster, and her name is Larissa Miller. And Rita found out about a project and Larissa is a supply chain guru, and always thinking outside the box in terms of value chains or supply chains. And she's very woven into the PA ag scene and, of course, in a fairly substantial food economy, basically, like in Lancaster. Right? And she said, what would happen if we built a demand-driven beef solution for a grocery store chain? I think intriguing. So she created a company called Keystone Farms Future, and last year we signed a memorandum of understanding with them. And Keystone Farms Future has a relationship with an independent grocery store chain in central PA called Carnes, K-A-R-N-S. It's like 12 stores, kind of around Carlisle and Reading and that area around there, right? Lancaster. And what they did was they met with the owners of Carnes, which made its name before they were a big-time grocery store, big-time in quotes. Before they were an independent grocery store chain with 10 stores, they focused primarily on their reputation as a butcher shop. And over the years, they evolved into using all the certified Angus beef programs, the CAB registered program, basically, for their store. But what Larissa came back to them and said, well, wouldn't it be cool if you weren't using a generic product, right? Because Angus beef can come from Iowa, it can come from Indiana, it can come from... There's nothing particularly Pennsylvania about it. So she built a program which basically provides the only PA preferred beef program, at least up until right now. She has the PA preferred beef designation for her program. She goes out, and what she does is she has a partner who's a vet, and she has a partner who's an expert in raising and managing beef herds, and she has a partner who specializes in nutrition. And what they did was they identified an opportunity to come in and provide Carnes with an exclusive Carnes-only program. And the way they do it is, for Carnes, they buy all the calves. Right now they're sourcing all the calves from Virginia. They bring them into Pennsylvania. They take them to an intake center, which is actually the Harris potato chip farm. I kid you not, I was there. I was there twice, so I know a lot more. I know more about Harris potato chips than I care to imagine. And they bring the cows in and they treat them as a group, right? And so they do all the assessments. They do all the evaluation on the animals. Right? They take a look at their health, wellness, their weight, their size, everything that goes with that. And then they keep them together, which is exactly what Temple Grandin would do. So that you don't separate the cows independently from one another. You actually treat them as a pod, right? Keep them as a cluster. So they come into the intake center, they get processed, they get tagged, they get scanned, and sitting down with the grocery store owners, they come up with what the grocery store owners want in terms of grade, USDA, percentage of lean, percentage of fat, I mean, all that stuff. There's like 25 or 30 different metrics in beef, right? Who knew? I just this tastes pretty good. It's like, no. There's 25 ways it could taste good.
Or not.
Or not. And then what happens is they take the cows and they put them out on a participating farm. And mostly those farms are actually former dairy farms, because the dairy farms, of course, have unused feedlots. So the cows end up going out to the feedlots after they get to the required weight to get to the induction center, right? So it's about 6 months out on pasture, into the induction center, and then 6 months onto the feedlot and the open space basically around the feedlot. And they sign up these farmers to participate, to take care of their cows for them. Kind of like a cow Airbnb, right, if you think about it. And again, they're all together. So the cows all know each other, which is interesting because it means less stress on the animal. It means that the cows are only moving once. Moving cows in the cattle business, just like in the hog and pig business, the more you move them, the higher the mortality rate. More of the animals die in transit. And when they're transported too much, they stress out, which affects everything, including the quality of the product after you process the meat, all the way top to bottom, right? So now these farms have their 60 cows. That's their allocation for Carnes. Carnes is telling Larissa how many animals they're going to take each month. So she then has 100% visibility in terms of when the herd goes from early stage induction and evaluation to going to the processing plant. And again, only 2 trips, not 5 or 6, which is what's typical in the industry. And if you happen to live in the neighborhood where the grocery store is and you happen to be driving up one of those roads, there's a sign out in the front of the farm that says, "We raise Carnes beef." And it's Carnes' herd. Carnes owns the herd, right? It's their herd, right? So the whole idea behind Keystone is for them to manage the herd for the customer, who's the end market user, right? That's where that cow's going to end up. And they have complete traceability on the animal. So when that cow arrives slaughtered in primal and subprimal, they know exactly who that cow is and where it came from and what farm it was raised on and all the way back to the beginning. Kind of like Organic Valley, right? The way you were talking about Organic Valley. It's a very scalable model because there's a lot of family farms that currently have a lot of excess capacity in this regard because they've cut back their dairy herds and a lot of other issues. And it gives the grocery store chain something that is uniquely theirs because nobody can compete with them on that. So we invited Giant Eagle to come on out and take a look. We were successful in getting them to organize their whole sort of butcher program team, which is fairly extensive, to come out and make a trip to Lancaster with us to spend 2 days essentially touring all these farms and seeing how the animals are organized and how the nutrition is organized and how the medical care is organized and how they grade out when they're taken to the plant for processing. And it took about 2 to 3 months worth of hand-holding with the folks at Giant Eagle. Because remember, we were talking about if you're involved in the Certified Angus program, then you're paying a fee for that from the Certified Angus program. And you are doing what every other grocery store chain in the market is doing as well, whether it's Shop and Save or Whole Foods or whatever. So you're trying to convince a grocery store retailer to do something different, which is not an easy thing to do. I think we're there.
Got 'em.
I think
At
we're
least
there.
they're looking at your...
They're real serious. We're going to enhance that because one of the things that Larissa doesn't have is she doesn't have a breeding facility in Pennsylvania. We think we have a breeding facility in Pennsylvania, a good one. The guy who owns this operation down outside of Connellsville is first class. His family was in the beef business for almost 100 years. He's getting back into it again after a career in excavation and granite mining. And so if we put that piece together, now we've completely closed this loop. And so everything about this program is inside the state of Pennsylvania, which is really unique.
That's really impressive, yeah.
And the people that are participating in the program have 100% transparency on all their costs. We're basically taking the whole concept of the commodity marketplace for beef. You know how beef prices go up and down and all over the place depending on weather and severity and all this other shit, right? And that's because everybody buys on the market. These guys will have already bought. They will have bought their calves. It's their herd. And everything after that is a controllable expense. And it is not driven by the market. So now you're the grocery retailer and all of a sudden you've got, okay, I know exactly what that pound of steak is going to cost me and what I can charge the customer. I don't have to keep moving that number around based on it was a bad year for cows in Wyoming or whatever. That's one of our next big initiatives. That will be next year, 2024. We'll have our first herd with Giant Eagle's name on it probably by next year. Even though there's a reduced number of USDA certified processors in Western PA, and we've had those conversations at Kraft and Chatham and all that. It turns out that there are some good processors. The one that we're talking to is up near State College called Nicholas. Here's the deal, right? The thing that really people don't take into account is, let's say you're, what's the name of the processor I'm trying to think of that's in Saxonburg? You know what I'm talking about.
I do,
Toma. Well, when Toma's not doing their own, when they're doing contract processing, it's based on whatever comes through the front door and when there's an available slot, right? So one of the things that this program does for the processor is it tells them in advance, months in advance, how many cows are coming into the front door every week. And for a processor, that's gold, right? Because now you can actually rationally plan. That's why everybody used to talk about how the deer hunting season throws everything up in the air, because if the hunters start coming in with all those deer carcasses to get processed, Greg would talk about this in terms of just getting his pigs processed over at Blackberry Meadow Farm. I mean, all of a sudden you thought you were going to be first in line and now you're at the end of the line. Good luck getting in.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, with the regularity of this and wanting to have a constant supply, depending on, I mean, how many stores does Giant Eagle have?
If you don't count the get-goes, it's about 150. Well, in 3 states.
I mean, that's a lot of stores to supply meat to. So it seems like they could almost set up a dedicated processing facility for this purpose.
Yes, there has been that discussion. I've heard that discussion from them.
Look how smart I am. I'm keeping up with you guys.
How about that?
Well,
So-
Joe, this has been amazing, and I really, really appreciate your time. I know we've gone way over time, but I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on my podcast.
It's been my pleasure. And tell all your listeners to go out and buy some Harvest PA beer at the Giant Eagle stores. It's available. Now, you can only buy 2 6-packs at a time because of our weird liquor laws, but
Awesome. All right.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon. Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon.
With Bowl and Spoon is written, produced, and hosted by me, Shelly Danko Day. Copy editing by Carolyn Ristow, details reviewed. Original theme song was written and performed by Paul Labrise and Friends. You can listen to With Bowl and Spoon anywhere you get your podcasts. Follow us and send us questions or messages on Facebook and Instagram or on our website, withbowlandspoon.com. Thanks for listening.